In a small town in Oklahoma, Ben Carter's life seemed to be exactly what anyone would dream of. At 38, he was a successful restaurant owner, respected in the community, and married to Natalie, a beautiful and talented beauty expert. Together, they had built a life full of love and ambition. They lived in a spacious house on the outskirts of town, where the noise of the city was far enough to give them peace but close enough to stay connected to the vibrant life of their town. Ben worked tirelessly to ensure that his restaurant thrived, constantly adjusting the menu and refining the service to keep his loyal customers coming back. He was proud of what he had built, a family business that had weathered the ups and downs of the market. Natalie, on the other hand, ran her beauty salon with the same dedication. She was known for her expertise and her ability to make every client feel beautiful, inside and out. The couple balanced their work with their family life, ensuring that their 2 children, Lucy and Sam, had everything they needed to succeed. Life, for all intents and purposes, appeared flawless. The days were filled with routine, but it was a good routine, one that left them both feeling fulfilled and happy. Ben loved the simple things: family dinners, weekend trips to the lake, and quiet evenings spent on the porch with Natalie watching the sunset. But underneath the surface of their ideal life, something was starting to shift. It began with a conversation that Ben had with his business partner, Jack. Jack had invited Natalie to meet some of his colleagues at a local gathering, where they could network and form stronger business relationships. At first, Ben thought it would be a good opportunity for Natalie to get to know some of the town's most influential business people. He was proud of her and wanted her to feel involved in his professional world. That evening, as Ben watched Natalie interact with the guests, he noticed something unsettling. Alex Brooks, a close friend of Ben's, seemed to pay an unusual amount of attention to Natalie. Their conversations were too intimate, too personal. Ben shook the feeling off, telling himself it was nothing more than professional courtesy. After all, Alex was a charming man, and Natalie had a friendly, outgoing personality. Still, something lingered in the back of Ben's mind, gnawing at him. A few weeks later, that feeling would grow into something much more unsettling. It was a quiet evening when Ben stumbled upon something he wasn't expecting. He was working late in the restaurant when he received a call from his secretary asking him to come to his office for an urgent matter. Upon arriving, he found an email on the computer that changed everything. The email was a series of messages between Natalie and Alex. The tone of the messages was not one of friendship or professional respect, but something far more personal. The words they shared left no room for doubt. Ben's heart sank, his thoughts racing. He sat there, staring at the screen, unable to process what he had just read. His mind couldn't wrap around the idea of his wife, the woman he had built a life with, betraying him in such a way. For hours, he sat in silence, unable to tear himself away from the screen. The evidence was undeniable. But as the realization set in, Ben knew that confronting Natalie immediately would only make things worse. Instead, he decided to take a different approach, one that would give him the answers he needed without making a scene. The next day, he hired a private investigator. He knew that if he wanted the truth, he would have to watch from the sidelines. He couldn't risk letting Natalie know that he suspected anything. For now, he had to let the investigator do the work, and he needed to keep his emotions in check. The truth was out there and he would find it, but he had to be patient. Ben's mind raced as he planned the next steps. The restaurant was doing well, and he didn't want to risk disrupting their family life. Yet at the same time, he couldn't ignore the feeling of betrayal that was eating away at him. The sting of the betrayal was worse than anything he had ever experienced. He tried to keep up with his daily responsibilities, but every time he saw Natalie's face, all he could think about was the truth that he had uncovered. He knew it would be difficult to face her, but he wasn't ready to confront her just yet. For now, he would wait. He would watch, listen, and plan his next move carefully. Ben Carter's life was about to change forever, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. But one thing was clear: he was going to find out the truth no matter what it took. As the days passed, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. His usual routine, once comforting, now felt like a dull, repetitive cycle. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Natalie and Alex, wondering how long the affair had been going on. Was it recent? Or had it been brewing for months, even years? He couldn't bear to think of the extent of the betrayal. Ben tried to focus on his work, pushing through the hours in the kitchen and overseeing the restaurant. But even as he interacted with staff and customers, his thoughts constantly drifted back to the email he had found. Each moment with Natalie felt hollow, like they were both just going through the motions of a relationship that had lost its foundation. He couldn't help but feel the distance between them, even when they were sitting across from each other at dinner, pretending everything was fine. In the following weeks, the private investigator Ben hired reported back with more unsettling findings. The investigator had tracked Natalie and Alex to several private locations, restaurants, hotels, even their homes. The investigator had captured footage of the two of them together, their interactions clearly more than just professional. There were moments of intimacy, touching, lingering glances, that left no room for doubt. Ben felt his world collapse each time he watched the footage. His anger and hurt simmered beneath the surface, but he had made a vow to himself. He wouldn't confront Natalie yet. He wanted to be sure, completely sure, before he did anything. The more Ben watched the footage, the more he realized that this wasn't just a random fling. This was something deeper, something far more serious. Alex had been playing his part as a close friend of Ben for years, but now it seemed as though he had been playing another role altogether, one that Ben had never seen coming. Ben found himself growing restless, his sleep interrupted by thoughts of how he would confront both Natalie and Alex. But he knew one thing for sure, it had to be done on his terms, not theirs. He had to control the narrative, make sure that when the truth came out, it would be in a way that would make them both feel the consequences of their actions. Ben was determined to have his say, but he wasn't ready to show his cards just yet. One evening, as Ben sat at the bar of his restaurant, he found himself lost in thought, staring at the half-empty glass in front of him. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, but Ben's mind was elsewhere. He barely noticed when one of his regular customers, Jack, slid onto the stool next to him. Jack had always been a good friend, and Ben found himself venting to him more often than he cared to admit. But tonight he wasn't sure he could keep it together. "You okay, man?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ben sighed deeply, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I don't know, Jack. I feel like my whole life is a lie." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Ben hesitated, the words catching in his throat. But finally he decided to open up. He had to share this with someone. "I found out something about Natalie. Something that I can't just ignore." Jack was quiet for a moment, sensing the gravity of Ben's words. "What happened? What do you mean?" Ben leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "She's having an affair. With Alex." Jack's expression shifted, but he didn't say anything for a long while. Ben could tell his friend was processing the information, trying to figure out what to say next. "I'm sorry, Ben. I had no idea." Ben's gaze hardened, his mind already working through the next steps. "I can't just sit here and let this go. I've been watching them for weeks now and it's killing me. I need to do something." Jack frowned, his tone shifting to one of concern. "You need to be careful, man. If you're sure about this, I get it, but you don't want to make any rash decisions." Ben nodded, understanding his friend's caution. "I'm not making any rash decisions. I just need to know everything, every last detail before I say anything to her. But when I do, it's going to be huge. I'm going to expose the whole thing." Jack studied Ben for a moment, his face a mixture of sympathy and caution. "I know you're hurting, but remember there are consequences to everything. Just make sure you're ready for what comes next." Ben's eyes darkened, a fire igniting inside him. "I'm ready. And when the time comes, it'll be their turn to face the truth." As Jack left him alone at the bar, Ben couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision. He had to get everything right, every detail in place. His next move would be crucial. He would confront Natalie when the time was right, when he had all the evidence he needed to make sure she couldn't deny what she had done. But for now he needed patience. He needed to let the pieces fall into place before he made his final move. There was no going back once the truth was exposed, and Ben was determined to make sure it all came to light, no matter the cost. The following days seemed to blur together for Ben, each one feeling like a repeat of the last. He went through the motions, managing his restaurant, meeting with customers, and making small talk with Natalie. But inside he was far from present. His mind was consumed with the idea of exposing the truth. The anticipation of what was to come gnawed at him, but he knew he had to be patient. Every decision, every move had to be calculated. Natalie, oblivious to Ben's growing suspicions, carried on with her routine as if nothing was amiss. She was as busy as ever with her beauty salon, working long hours and often returning home late. The energy between them had shifted. There was a certain awkwardness now whenever they shared a room. Ben couldn't help but notice the subtle signs. The way Natalie avoided certain questions, the way she seemed distracted as if she was hiding something. But every time he tried to confront her, she brushed him off with a smile and a quick change of subject. She never suspected that Ben knew. Still, Ben could feel the weight of the secret hanging between them, and each moment of silence felt like a crack in their once perfect relationship. He had tried to keep up appearances for the sake of their children, but even they seemed to sense the tension. Lucy, their 10-year-old daughter, had started to ask more questions like why mommy and daddy were always so quiet around each other. Ben didn't have an answer for her. How could he explain that everything he thought he knew was a lie? Natalie, on the other hand, appeared to be living in her own world. She was more focused on her salon and the success she was building than on their home life. Ben couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation, the kind where they talked about their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Now, all they shared were logistical discussions about the kids or the occasional mention of a family event. It wasn't that they fought, there was no argument or heated words exchanged, but there was a hollow emptiness that filled the spaces between them. One evening, after a long day at the restaurant, Ben sat alone in his office, reviewing the latest report from the private investigator. The evidence was overwhelming. There were pictures of Natalie and Alex in the most compromising situations, images that were impossible to ignore. But as Ben stared at the photographs, he found himself hesitating. What would happen after he exposed the truth? Would their family be able to recover from this betrayal? Could he ever forgive Natalie for what she had done? Ben's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He looked up to find Natalie standing in the doorway, her expression soft but cautious. "Ben," she began, her voice tentative. "I think we need to talk." Ben's heart skipped a beat. This was it. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't sure he was ready. Natalie had never been one to shy away from tough conversations, but this one felt different. There was something about the way she stood there, her eyes avoiding his, that made Ben's stomach tighten. "Sure," Ben replied, trying to sound casual, though his mind was racing. "What's on your mind?" Natalie took a deep breath before stepping into the room and sitting down across from him. She fiddled with her fingers, looking down at the floor before meeting his eyes. "I know something's been off between us lately," she said quietly. "I can feel it. And I don't want to ignore it any longer. Is there something you're not telling me, Ben?" Ben's pulse quickened. He wanted to tell her everything right then and there, to confront her with the truth, but something inside him told him to hold back just a little longer. He needed her to say more, to give him the opening he needed to finally expose her lies. "There's nothing," Ben said, keeping his tone even. "Maybe we've both just been a little overwhelmed with everything going on." Natalie didn't look convinced. "Ben, I know you. You've been distant. And I don't want to be left in the dark anymore." Ben leaned back in his chair, considering his next words carefully. This was the perfect opportunity, yet he felt a strange reluctance. He could feel the anger building up inside him, but it was tempered with sadness. He couldn't stop thinking about the family they had built together, the years of memories, the laughter, the love. Could he really tear all of that down with one revelation? "I'm not hiding anything, Natalie," Ben said, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe you're just stressed with work. We've both been so busy lately." Natalie's eyes narrowed slightly, and Ben could see the doubt beginning to creep in. She wasn't buying it. She knew him too well. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Something's going on, Ben. You've been acting like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You don't have to carry it alone." Ben didn't answer immediately. He simply watched her, weighing his options. He could keep up the facade, continue pretending that everything was fine, or he could finally expose the truth. But what would that do to their family? Was he ready for the fallout? The silence between them grew heavy. Natalie's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing her hand on the desk in front of him. "I just want to know what's really going on, Ben. Please." Ben took a deep breath, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, and for a moment, he almost caved. Almost. But he knew he couldn't go back now. The truth was already set in motion, and no amount of pleading could change that. "I'll tell you everything soon, Natalie," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not yet." Natalie's face fell, a mixture of confusion and hurt crossing her features. She didn't understand, but Ben didn't have the heart to explain any further. "Not yet." As Natalie stood and walked out of the room, Ben couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. He knew the moment of truth was drawing near, and there would be no turning back. The calm before the storm was over. The days leading up to the charity event were a whirlwind for Ben. He had been working tirelessly to ensure that everything would go smoothly. The event was a major annual fundraiser for the restaurant, and he had invited some of the most influential figures in town. The guest list was impressive, featuring local celebrities, business owners, and politicians. It was the kind of event that would elevate the reputation of his restaurant, and Ben was determined to make it unforgettable. Yet, amidst all the preparations, Ben's mind was preoccupied with the plan he had set in motion. The time was finally coming for the truth to be exposed. He had gathered all the evidence he needed, carefully collected by the private investigator. The video, the photos, the messages, they were all lined up, ready to be unveiled. The thought of confronting Natalie in front of their closest friends and colleagues was both thrilling and terrifying. Ben wasn't sure how he would feel once the truth was out, but he knew one thing: it had to be done. The night of the event arrived and the restaurant was transformed. Elegant white tablecloths adorned the tables, and soft golden lights illuminated the room. The air was filled with the chatter of guests as they mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging business cards. Ben stood near the entrance, greeting everyone with a warm smile, doing his best to mask the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Natalie, ever the professional, looked radiant as she moved through the crowd, chatting with guests and ensuring everything was in order. She seemed completely unaware of what was about to happen. Ben observed her from across the room, the weight of his secret pressing heavily on his chest. His heart was pounding as he made his way through the crowd, greeting familiar faces while keeping a careful eye on Natalie. She was distracted, caught up in conversations, and he realized that this might be the perfect moment to make his move. As the evening progressed, Ben made sure everything was running smoothly. The guests were enjoying themselves, the food was being served on time, and the event was shaping up to be a success. But Ben's thoughts were elsewhere. His mind was constantly running through the plan, rehearsing the moment when he would reveal everything. He knew that once he exposed Natalie and Alex, there would be no going back. The fallout would be immediate and he would have to face the consequences. As the evening wore on, Ben noticed the time. It was almost the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would expose Natalie's betrayal. The speech was coming up soon, and Ben had arranged for a brief video presentation to be shown during the speech. It was all part of his plan. He had ensured that the projector was set up, the screen was in place, and the video was ready to go. Everything was set. Ben stepped up to the stage, his heart racing. He took a deep breath as he looked out over the crowd. The chatter gradually faded, and all eyes were on him. For a moment he simply stood there, collecting his thoughts. "Good evening, everyone," Ben began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. This event is incredibly important to me, not just because of what we're raising funds for, but because of the support I've received from all of you throughout the years. Tonight, we celebrate community, generosity, and the spirit of togetherness." The crowd nodded, some of them raising their glasses in agreement. Ben paused, allowing the words to sink in. Then, with a calm that seemed almost surreal to him, he continued. "But there is something that needs to be addressed," Ben said, his voice growing more serious. "Something that, for the sake of transparency and honesty, I cannot keep to myself any longer. I have always believed in being open and truthful with those closest to me, and tonight I am going to do just that." The room grew silent. Ben could see a few guests exchanging curious glances, unsure of where this was going. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he stood tall, resolute in his decision. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about this," Ben said, his voice softer now, "and I've come to the conclusion that some things need to be revealed. For the sake of my family, my business, and my own peace of mind, the truth cannot stay hidden any longer." At this point he gestured to the projector screen behind him. The room was silent, all eyes focused on him as he pressed play on the remote control. The video began, showing footage of Natalie and Alex together, laughing, touching, and sharing moments of intimacy. Ben could hear the gasps from the crowd as they watched the footage unfold, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Natalie's face turned pale as she stood frozen in the crowd, her hand instinctively moving to her mouth. Ben watched her closely, seeing the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She was caught and there was no denying it. As the video ended, Ben turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Natalie was shaking, her eyes welling with tears as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Ben asked quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You thought you could keep this from me? But I knew. I knew all along, Natalie. And I couldn't just sit by and pretend that everything was fine." The room was dead silent. Ben could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, but he didn't flinch. He had made his decision and now there was no turning back. Natalie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked around the room, her face a mask of shock, shame, and confusion. Her eyes met Ben's, but he didn't look away. "I never wanted to hurt you like this," Ben continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you left me no choice." The event that had started as a celebration of success had turned into something entirely different. A moment of exposure, of truth. The room was filled with whispers, some guests unsure of how to react, others just standing in shock. Ben could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of relief. The truth had been revealed and there was no going back. The moments that followed the video's exposure felt like a blur to Ben. The once lively atmosphere of the charity event had shifted into a tense silence. Guests murmured in disbelief, their conversations hushed as they processed what had just unfolded. Some were looking at Natalie, others at Ben, but no one knew what to say. The shock of the revelation had paralyzed the room, leaving everyone in a state of stunned silence. Ben remained calm even though his heart was racing. He couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory, despite the deep hurt he was still carrying inside. He had planned this moment for weeks, carefully orchestrating every detail. And now the truth was out in the open. But as he stood there looking out over the crowd, Ben began to feel a gnawing emptiness. This wasn't a moment of triumph, it was a moment of devastation, and the weight of it began to sink in. Natalie was still standing frozen by the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She looked like she was in a daze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Slowly, her gaze shifted from Ben to Alex, who was standing off to the side, his face equally ashen. It was clear that neither of them had expected to be exposed in such a public way. Natalie's voice was barely audible as she spoke, her words shaking. "Ben, I didn't." She stopped herself, her emotions breaking through as tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Ben felt a cold rush of anger mix with his lingering sadness, but he forced himself to stay composed. This wasn't the time for raw emotion. He had made his choice and now there was no room for any more explanations. "Not tonight." "You had a choice, Natalie," Ben said, his voice steady but firm. "You chose to lie, you chose to betray me. You chose to deceive everyone who trusted you." He could see her struggling to find the right words, but there was nothing left to say. She had already done the damage. She had already shattered everything they had built together. "I know I've hurt you," Natalie whispered, her voice filled with regret. "But please, Ben, just let me explain. Just, let me explain." Ben shook his head slowly. "There's nothing left to explain, Natalie. The truth is out. What's done is done." The room remained thick with tension as the guests awkwardly shuffled around, unsure of how to react. Some seemed sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable. Alex, who had been quiet throughout the entire scene, finally spoke up, his voice strained. Alex started, but Ben cut him off, his anger rising. "You don't get to say anything, Alex. You've already done enough damage," Ben snapped. His gaze burned into Alex, a mix of fury and disappointment in his eyes. Alex recoiled slightly, his expression shifting from shock to guilt. "Ben, I never meant for things to go this far. I'm sorry." Ben didn't say anything in response. There was nothing more to say. The pain was too raw, too deep, and no words would fix what had been broken. With one last look at Alex, Ben turned and walked out of the room, his mind racing with emotions. He didn't want to face anyone else. He didn't want to be in that room anymore. Natalie tried to follow him, but Ben stopped in his tracks before she could reach him. "No, Natalie," he said without turning around. "This is over. Don't follow me." He didn't wait for a response. He couldn't. The weight of betrayal was too much, and he had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. He walked through the back doors of the restaurant and out into the cool night air, needing space to breathe, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had overtaken the event. Outside, the night sky was clear, the stars twinkling softly above him. Ben stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had done what he needed to do. The truth had been revealed. But now, there was nothing but a hollow emptiness that lingered in its wake. He thought about his children, about how this would affect them. He thought about the years he had spent building a life with Natalie, the dreams they had shared, and how it all seemed so fragile now. All of it was slipping away. The family they had created, the love they once shared, was gone. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, Ben's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. He had already received several messages from Natalie, and no doubt she was trying to reach him. But Ben knew there was nothing she could say that would change anything. The lies, the betrayal, they were too deep to fix with a simple apology. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt completely alone. He had made the decision to expose the truth, but now that it was out in the open, he realized just how much pain it had caused. It was as if the weight of his entire life had just come crashing down on him, and he didn't know where to go from here. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, Ben realized that this was only the beginning. The fallout from tonight would reverberate for months, maybe years. But for now he needed to figure out how to move forward. And that was something he had no answer to yet. The days after the charity event felt like they moved in slow motion for Ben. The initial shock of exposing Natalie and Alex had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness and confusion. His life, the life he thought was stable and built on trust, had crumbled in a single devastating moment. Now he was left to pick up the pieces, but the path forward was unclear. The following morning, Ben woke up to an uncomfortable silence in the house. The kids were still asleep, and Natalie hadn't returned to their bedroom the night before. Ben knew she had spent the night at her sister's place, and he could only imagine the emotional storm she was going through. But in the pit of his stomach, he felt a sense of calm that surprised him. The truth had been exposed. There was nothing more to hide. He tried to focus on his responsibilities at the restaurant, but his mind wandered constantly to the events of the previous night. He had never imagined that things would unfold the way they had. He had expected some form of confrontation, perhaps an angry exchange of words, but the reality was more jarring than he could have anticipated. The cold, stunned silence of the guests, the looks of disbelief as they watched the video, it was a moment he couldn't shake from his mind. The phone call started coming in the next morning, most of them from friends and colleagues who had attended the event. Some expressed sympathy, others asked for an explanation. But Ben wasn't in the mood to explain. He didn't owe anyone anything. The truth was out, and that was all that mattered. Ben knew he couldn't hide forever though. Eventually he would have to face Natalie. She had been texting him non-stop since the moment he walked out of the restaurant, her messages ranging from pleading to angry, asking for a chance to talk, to explain herself. But Ben wasn't ready to hear her out. Not yet. He had spent the last few weeks living in the shadow of her lies, and now he needed time to process what had happened before he could face her. The silence in the house grew unbearable by the time the afternoon rolled around. Ben found himself pacing the living room, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He could hear the kids playing in the background, their laughter innocent and unaffected by the chaos that had unfolded in their parents' lives. Ben's heart twisted at the thought of them, knowing that their world had just been shattered. Just as he was about to reach for his phone to check the messages again, there was a soft knock at the door. Ben froze, his heart skipping a beat. He didn't have to guess who it was. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy as he walked to the door and opened it. There stood Natalie, looking worn and tearful, her eyes red from crying. Ben didn't say anything. He simply stepped aside to let her in. The tension between them was palpable, and neither of them knew where to begin. "I'm sorry, Ben," Natalie said, her voice shaky. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." Ben could feel his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear her apology, but he knew he had to face this moment, no matter how painful it was. "You say you never meant to hurt me," Ben replied, his voice flat. "But you did, Natalie. You hurt me. You hurt our family. I don't know if you understand how much this changes everything." Natalie's eyes filled with tears again. She reached out, but Ben pulled back slightly, not wanting to let her close. "I don't know what to say, Ben," she continued, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't about you. It wasn't about us. It was about something I lost along the way. Something that I was too afraid to confront." Ben's anger flared. "What do you mean, something you lost? You're telling me that you needed to cheat to find yourself? You betrayed me, Natalie. For what? For a fling? For something you could have fixed by talking to me? You didn't have to do this." "I wasn't thinking clearly," Natalie whispered. I don't know. I was lonely. We weren't talking anymore. And Alex, I don't even know how it happened. It just did." Ben stared at her for a long moment, the words hanging heavy in the air. The shock of it all still hadn't worn off,